Across the Star Wars movies, Anakin Skywalker has 3 different lightsabers, but technically 4 if you consider the differences between the original trilogy sabers that he used. There are just differences in the way that the hilt looks because of mismanagement by the props department. But that's neither here nor there. He used 3 different lightsabers for the purpose of this video. He used this one first of all, which is what he used in Attack of the Clones, which if you remember, he used it and it was destroyed in the factory on Geonosis. Then he used this saber, which is what he used in Clone Wars and what he used in Revenge of the Sith. This saber was then taken by Obi-Wan Kenobi when he defeated him on Mustafar, and then from that point on, we technically never see that saber again. However, if you watch the movies in order from 1, 2, 3, the prequel trilogy, then the original trilogy, then you watch the sequel trilogy, you'll notice that there is a difference in the saber that Anakin used in Revenge of the Sith and Clone Wars, and what you see in the original and sequel trilogies. Anakin Skywalker used 3 different sabers, the first one in Attack of the Clones, the second one in Clone Wars and Revenge of the Sith, and then he used the red-bladed saber in Empire Strikes Back, A New Hope, and Return of the Jedi. So he uses 3 different sabers. Luke Skywalker uses 2 different sabers. Luke Skywalker uses what Obi-Wan calls his father's lightsaber. However, for the purpose of this video, and for the purpose of continuity with the props, he never used his father's lightsaber, and I'll get into that in just a second. He also uses this right here, this thin neck saber, which if you're talking about in terms of the real life prop, actually was one of Obi-Wan Kenobi's stunt sabers from A New Hope that they used in Return of the Jedi as the green-bladed saber for the purpose of continuity because Luke lost his saber in Empire Strikes Back on the duel in Bespin. They used a different style saber because they didn't want to have to fill that plot hole with something else. George Lucas and the production team for Return of the Jedi, they had to create a new saber because he lost it in the previous movie. So they created a new one, a new hilt, which was heavily inspired by or used by Sir Alec Guinness and the props team in A New Hope. He used those 2 different sabers. In The Last Jedi, the flashback scene where Luke is holding his saber against Ben Solo, that saber is slightly different from the one that we see in Return of the Jedi. However, it's still the same hilt. Companies like Denis Lukyanov, he sells what he calls the creepy uncle hilt, and I think he has 3 or so different variations of that hilt. That one is based on the prop that we see in The Last Jedi, the creepy uncle hilt. It's slightly different from the one in Return of the Jedi, and I believe Roman Props also sells one, the Balance V4. I think that is also the same thing, just a slightly different hilt than the Return of the Jedi hilt. But that's neither here nor there. So Luke Skywalker has 2 different sabers. Anakin Skywalker has 3 different sabers. Whatever you think of the sequels, Rey uses 2 different sabers other than the one at the very end of Rise of Skywalker. She uses 2 different sabers. So she uses the one that they say was Luke's, that is found on the box in Maz Kanata's castle. That one, and then when it splits apart in The Last Jedi and she puts it together, that's what people call the Brokeflex, the Reflex, the Rayflex, whatever you want to call it. That is essentially its own saber because it makes a different sound, it looks different. So for the purpose of this video, we're going to call it its own saber. So Rey uses 2 different sabers other than the one that she uses at the very end of The Rise of Skywalker. So what is the Skywalker lightsaber? If you're talking about in terms of continuity, with the original trilogy, the original saber was created by Roger Christian, who worked on props for the original trilogy. He went to a thrift store and found what is called a Graflex flash gun. Now, if you don't know, back in the old days, there were cameras that had these external flash guns and it had a bulb in it. So when you took a picture, the bulb went off, blah, 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 whatever you can see in this picture here, what a Graflex flash gun looked like. So he saw one of those. He found some in a box in a thrift store somewhere in London, I believe, and he bought those because he thought it felt futuristic. So he got one of those. So obviously took the top part and the bulb part out. Then he threw some T-tracks on there. The origins of the T-tracks are a little hard to nail down, but George Lucas had some input on that. So that became what we now call just the Graflex lightsaber. It's what many people refer to as a Skywalker lightsaber, and that is what I have right here. This is a Graflex. Now this is a replica, this is not a vintage. A vintage is one that is actually made from a Graflex flash gun that was used in the 1930s, 40s, whenever it was made. This is a replica. This particular one is from Jeff Parks, way back in the day. This is the Parks Graflex 2.0. This is one that many people nowadays are looking for because a lot of people use these to cut up and make scrap killers, scrap flexes, all that different stuff. They just cut this whole section, blah, 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 whatever. These are kind of looked after because they're not made anymore by Jeff Parks. So this one is not the most accurate version of the Graflex ever made. Not even close. The most accurate version would be a vintage one. One is actually made from a Graflex flash gun. So this is the Parks 2.0 Graflex. As you can see here, bunny ears, this is what held in the light bulb. This section up here, although part of it is the same as a regular Graflex flash gun, they did take creative liberties, and especially when you get down to this section here, they have a Graflex clamp around here. This chrome looking piece here, that is mylar tape, chrome mylar tape. It's kind of mirrored. That was to cover the portion of the clamp that says Graflex on it to make it feel a little bit more in-universe. This part here, they have two buttons. I set this up, or actually Sebastian at Starlight Sabers set this up in the Empire Strikes Back configuration, and I'll show you what the differences are with those here in a second. But this is an Empire Strikes Back configuration Graflex in terms of the grips, the way that the clamp card looks, the mylar tape, the two buttons instead of a button and a glass eye, etc. The only thing that is pretty much wrong with this saber in terms of accuracy is this beer tab section. This is supposed to be off if you're going for Empire Strikes Back configuration. And obviously this bottom section is off. You see those holes in it. That's for sound venting because this was meant to be an FX saber or turned into a saber that can be installed. But that doesn't matter to me because that's not what I use it for anyway. This is what I use as my direct input saber for showing off sound fonts. This doesn't have a speaker or anything like that. This just has a wireless system so I can show off sound fonts. But that's neither here nor there. This is a Graflex. What you see in Revenge of the Sith is this. This is an Aniflex or a skinny flex. This is a slim flex, whatever you want to call it. This is an Aniflex. This is Anakin's saber from Revenge of the Sith. This is very different. Although at first glance it may look the same, this is very different to what you see in the original trilogy. This one right here is the Aniflex. This is a Graflex. And this is what this video is about. Now, at first glance, you may think, oh, that looks pretty similar, and it really isn't. And seeing it in person versus seeing it on camera, the camera's kind of washing it out in terms of the reflections from the lights right here. But this saber is chrome-plated brass, so it's very heavy. But it is as shiny as you see in the movies. It's a mirror, kind of like a mirrored finish. And that's what you see in the movies. This Graflex is sort of like a brushed or polished silver color, aluminum, which is what you see in the movies. So starting at the top, you see that kind of S-curve emitter here on both sabers. You see bunny ears, true bunny ears on this Graflex, but on here, they are rigid. These are both one piece, they don't move. These move, you know, they pinch so you can put the blade in. These don't move, they're rigid. So you have a button on either side underneath the bunny ears on both the Graflex and on the Aniflex. You also have this section here. Same thing on both of them pretty much. This one is smaller on the Aniflex than this. If you look at it head on, this is where you start to see quite a bit of difference. So on the Aniflex, you'll see a sort of goldish button. On this, you see like a dark red button. Now that is true to what you saw on a real Graflex, on a vintage Graflex. They're like a red or a dark red color. And on the Aniflex, which is what Anakin used in Revenge of the Sith, was like a gold, light brown button. So this section here, I'm probably forgetting the name of what it's called. It probably has a specific name. But on the Graflex, you have these two little sections right here. In all honesty, they kind of look like a USB port, but that's obviously not what it is. But that's what it looks like on a Graflex, and that's not present on an Aniflex. And by the way, this is the most accurate representation of Anakin's saber in Revenge of the Sith. This is the 7 Sabers Aniflex V2. I've done a video on it, as you can see up there in the top right section of this video. This is the most accurate iteration of this saber, and I absolutely love this saber. I barely use it because it is such a nice saber, and I'm so scared of, scratching it or dropping it or something like that. But this is the most accurate version. This one is not the most accurate version of a Graflex, obviously. Like I said, this is a Parks Graflex 2.0. So I also did another video on a Graflex, which you can see up there. That was an 89 Sabers Graflex, which a lot of people have. It is probably the most common Graflex out there, probably the most mass-produced version of the Graflex. And it's a great saber. It's not what I needed, and I got this in a trade, and I'm really glad I did. This is a 2.0, which is a very rare version of the Graflex, but it is an older version. So that aside, let's move down to the middle section, which is where a lot of difference comes into play. Aniflex on this side, Graflex on this side. So the middle section, you can see that the clamp card is quite different. So this is the Graflex here. You can see the difference. This was kind of a custom design that Lucasfilm did. So it's not a true clamp card. This is just kind of like in there. This is an actual clamp card. And then the clamp itself. So the Aniflex has this kind of gold slide switch thing. Doesn't actually serve a purpose on the hilt. But on here, this is an actual clamp that comes out to loosen the clamp's tightness around the hilt. And then on the grip section, they look somewhat similar. The Aniflex, it kind of just goes all the way down. There's no notch in the T-tracks themselves, but there are notches in the Graflex T-tracks, and there are these silver rivets. Now, this section right here kind of changes across the different iterations of the Graflex within the movies. This one I went for Empire Strikes Back version. So it has silver rivets, which is what you see in the sections of the movie Empire Strikes Back in Bespin, which is the version that I like the most, so that's what we went for. That will change, and I'll show you a little bit about that here in a second, but that was what I went for. But you can see that it looks totally different on the bottom with the Aniflex and the Graflex. And then the bottom, obviously, the Aniflex is just kind of flat, and then the Graflex, it has a D-ring, or a kobold, but the Aniflex, the way it attaches to the belt is with a cover tech wheel, which is what you saw in pretty much all the prequel movies. Instead of using D-rings or kobolds, they used cover tech wheels. So I don't know why that decision was made, but pretty much every single saber that you see in the prequel movies, they had cover tech wheels instead of D-rings. So some general differences, Aniflex and the Graflex, if you can kind of see that in shot, it's a little hard to. I have them bottom to bottom right here. The Aniflex is a longer hilt, and it is also quite significantly a skinnier hilt than the Graflex is. They look pretty much the same, but the clamp section here on the Aniflex sits a bit higher than the clamp section on the Graflex. So Aniflex has a little bit of a gap here. The Graflex does not have a little bit of a gap above the T-tracks. There are also other variations of the Graflex style saber. I'm going to go over this really quickly because there's other stuff I wanted to get into. But so here's the Graflex, and there's also another variation. This is a Star Killer. This is from the Force Unleashed series. This is very heavily inspired by a Graflex. Obviously not the same thing. These look pretty much totally different, except for a few little sections here and there. So bunny ears, S-curved emitter, kind of the same style of blade holder. This up here, and then this section here, these are like hard plastic or metal, but these are inspired by T-tracks, obviously, but way thinner and longer. So this is just a variation or something that's slightly inspired by a Graflex. Definitely not the same thing. And this one isn't entirely inspired by a Graflex, but it is in that same sort of vein. This is an MPP. This actually isn't from a replica company. This was something I got when I went to Disney World in the summer. I just picked this up for like 120 or something like that when I went to Disney Springs. But this is obviously in that same sort of vein. In the original trilogy, they tried to make the sabers look somewhat the same. So you have Darth Vader's saber here, Luke Skywalker's first saber here. There you go. I mean, obvious differences. This is a little bit more dark side looking, but this was made from an MPP flash, which was sort of like a Graflex flash, but I believe it was in a different country. That's not the point of this video. All I was trying to compare was the Graflex and the Aniflex, which I'll do right now. So the reason why I'm even making this video is because I see so many times on videos about a Graflex or videos on an Aniflex. So if you're talking about a Graflex, people are like, oh, I love that Aniflex. Or if you're talking about an Aniflex, people are like, oh, I love that Graflex. They are two totally different things. And the reason why that is because there was a continuity error by George Lucas and the props department at Lucasfilm when they were making the movies. So the first ever Graflex made by Roger Christian, that saber no longer exists because they were low budget when they're making that first movie. So they made it for the movie, they took it apart, and they gave it back to the thrift store or wherever they got that saber from, wherever they built it from. They gave that back. So they don't have that original saber. There are pictures of it and all that stuff, but that original first saber does not exist anymore. There was a clear line of succession for all the other props for the most part, but that original saber no longer exists. So the saber that we have known as the Skywalker lightsaber, this, by the way, is from Wanawanga. If you've never heard of Wanawanga, go check it out, because this is where you need to go to see what sabers actually look like in the movies. When it comes to replicas, this guy has it down pat. Roy, he did a great job compiling all of this stuff. Look, the Luke sabers, the Vader sabers, the Graflex, all the Graflex variants, the Leia saber. There are so many resources here from Wanawanga, and I'll leave this in the description below. But as you can see here, there are 3 different variations that you can see of the Skywalker lightsaber. This was the first variation we saw on screen. So this one right here, this was the first variation we saw on screen. So this has bubble strips here. Obviously this one I have does not have bubble strips. This one right here is kind of what I have right here. This is Empire Strikes Back variant, a New Hope variant, and then this is the sequel trilogy variant before it got destroyed and split in half. This is the Skywalker lightsaber. Now, I'm going to show you these shots real quick. There are details, specific details that kind of show you what exactly separates and differentiates between each variant. This is a whole lot of stuff that most of you thought you'd probably never ever go into detail in, and there's no reason why someone would need to go into that much detail, but it's actually completely fascinating if you go through and look into this. I've looked into this so many times, and it's super, super interesting how they trace the lineage of these props themselves. It's so interesting. So feel free to check that out. It's in the description below. But there are a few things here that I wanted to show you. So as you can see here, this is a prop lineage. So as we can see from A New Hope, the Luke stunt and the Luke hero. So the Luke stunt became a stunt for Empire Strikes Back. The Luke hero became the inspiration for the Rey hero in The Force Awakens and the Star Wars Holiday Specials. You don't got to pay attention to that, as well as the hero prop for Hoth and Dagobah and Bespin. However, the main difference is, like I showed you, the bubble strip and the bunny ears facing the opposite way versus New Hope and Empire Strikes Back. They flipped it. So that is sort of the lineage. But you can see here the lineage from the original Hilt goes down here, goes to Dagobah. The actual prop from Dagobah went to this, which is called the Ranch Saber. And there's a picture in here I'm going to show you of the Ranch Saber, and that's one that's very important in this argument or this conversation about Aniflex versus Graflex. So if you scroll down through this lightsaber guidebook, you'll find the prequel section, and you'll find Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber from Revenge of the Sith. So this is the first one from Attack of the Clones that he had, which is very, very much inspired by Darth Vader's saber. If you take a look at it, it's just a light side variant of Darth Vader's saber in the original trilogy. But if you look here, this saber, this chrome saber here, that's what I have right here. This is an Aniflex. As you can see, it says Anakin's lightsaber, aka the Skinnyflex or Aniflex, was based upon the Ranch Saber, which we'll show here in just a second. So here is the Ranch Saber. So if you remember that shot I showed you of the prop lineage with all those lines and stuff, this is the Ranch Saber. So this is what was a saber that was used possibly when they were filming the Dagobah scenes, hence why it looks so gross. This was the Ranch Saber. So this is at Skywalker Ranch, and this is one of the Graflexes possibly that they used in production. It got beat up a lot. So obviously at first glance, it is a Graflex. It's very obviously a Graflex, but if you look here in this section, this doesn't look like a Graflex. What this looks like is a knurled tape. And if you notice on the Aniflex, you have knurling. What they did for the prequels, for some reason, they modeled Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber after this saber. Maybe because it was available to them. It was available to George Lucas. It was available to the props department for that time in 2005. Maybe that's why. Although they do have access to Graflexes, and they have tons and tons of pictures and videos, and obviously the movies to study what the actual Graflex looked like. If they wanted to make that continuity perfect between episode 3 and episode 4, then they would have gotten an actual Graflex. But for some reason, they modeled and created the Aniflex or the Skinny Flex after this Ranch Saber, with some creative liberties, of course. But this is what they modeled it after. And that's pretty interesting. I mean, there are obvious differences between this saber and the Aniflex, the final product itself, as you can see here in the grip section. But this section here, this clamp section, and the way that the saber looked, for some reason the saber looked really chromed as compared to that brushed or like kind of matted silver finish that you see with a Graflex. This saber is a little bit more chromed. It had this knurling, and the clamp section looked a little off. So this was the basis for an Aniflex. For some reason or another, I'm not entirely sure. But there are differences between an Aniflex and a Graflex. But the Aniflex was inspired by the Graflex. Hence, it is not actually a Graflex. Graflex is not an Aniflex, and Aniflex is not a Graflex. They are not the same thing. I see that so often in my comments. I see that so often on Reddit. I see that so often in the groups. They're not the same thing. And I'm a little agitated when I see that. Maybe I shouldn't be agitated by that, but it just kind of agitates me a little bit. But now that you know, if you didn't know, go check out this one-on-one guidebook because it shows so much detail between those two different sabers. But every saber in the entire Star Wars universe, this was updated in March 2020. So after the point of all the movies being done, it has been updated. It'll probably get updated again once more Star Wars content comes out. They'll probably add in Ahsoka sabers once the Ahsoka series comes out, all that good stuff. But this video is about Graflexes and Aniflexes, which is something that I was, I love Graflexes, I love Aniflexes, but it's just something that I've seen so often is that people mistake the two. So I just kind of wanted to show you a few little differences between my own set of sabers as well as this lightsaber guidebook, which I have mentioned in the past on my channel, but I just wanted to mention this, and I wanted to, remind people who may have forgotten about this or introduce it to people who have never seen this before, because this is a great resource if you're looking at replica sabers when it comes to canon sabers, obviously. So this was a video about the Graflex and the Aniflex. Now that may be, to you, it may seem like a very picky video and something that it shouldn't agitate me as much as it does, but it is something obviously that I wanted to mention, and it's something that is actually very common, a very common mistake people have, and something that isn't super important in the grand scheme of things, but it's just something that I've noticed quite a bit. So I wanted to do a video on it, so there you go. Now you have a video on the Graflex versus the Aniflex, and I hope you took something from that. If you didn't, well, whatever. Thank you for watching the video anyway. But I left a link in the description below to Wanawanga's site. So you can check out the blueprints, you can check out the lightsaber guidebooks, you can see those differences because there are differences. So if you want to make your own build, if you want to buy a replica saber, I've done a video on that, by the way. If you want to do any of those things, feel free to check out that guidebook so you can make sure that you're getting or building the thing that you want that is closest to what you see in the actual movies. So if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, subscribe. Thank you all so much for watching, and may the Force be with you.